hello, this is Morel Bernard with the continuation of the story Wuthering Heights. And by the way, please subscribe to the channel and please share these videos. Much appreciated. Last words were, I believe I left them to seek the master, who was wondering what kept Catherine below so long. "Ellen," said he when I entered, "have you seen your mistress?" "Yes, she's in the kitchen, sir," I answered. "She's sadly put out by Mr. Heathcliff's behaviour, and indeed I do think it's time to arrange his visits on another footing. There's harm in being too soft, and now it's come to this." And I related the scene in the court and, as near as I dared, the whole subsequent dispute. I fancied it could not be very prejudicial to Mrs. Linton unless she made it so afterwards, by assuming the defensive for her guest. Edgar Linton had difficulty in hearing me to the close. His first words revealed that he did not clear his wife of blame. "This is insufferable," he exclaimed. "It is disgraceful that she should own him for a friend and force his company on me. Call me 2 men out of the hall. Ellen, Catherine shall linger no longer to argue with the low ruffian. I have humoured her enough." He descended, and bidding the servants wait in the passage, went, followed by me, to the kitchen. Its occupants had recommenced their angry discussion. Mrs. Linton, at least, was scolding with renewed vigour. Heathcliff had moved to the window and hung his head, somewhat cowed by her violent rating apparently. He saw the master first, and made a hasty motion that she should be silent, which she obeyed. On discovering the reason of his intimation, "How is this?" said Linton, addressing her. "What notion of propriety must you have to remain here, after the language which has been held to you by that blackguard? I suppose because it is ordinary talk you think nothing of it. You are habituated to his baseness, and perhaps imagine I can get used to it too." "Have you been listening at the door, Edgar?" asked the mistress in a tone particularly calculated to provoke her husband, implying both carelessness and contempt of his irritation. Heathcliff, who had raised his eyes at the former's speech, gave a sneering laugh at the latter on purpose. It seemed to draw Mr. Linton's attention to him. He succeeded, but Edgar did not mean to entertain him with any high lights of passion. "I've been so far forbearing with you, sir," he said quietly. "Not that I was ignorant of your miserable, degraded character, but I felt you were only partly responsible for that. And Catherine, wishing to keep up your acquaintance, I acquiesced foolishly. Your presence is a moral poison that would contaminate the most virtuous for that cause, and to prevent worse consequences, I shall deny you hereafter admission into this house, and give notice now that I require your instant departure. 3 minutes delay will render it involuntary and ignominious." Heathcliff measured the height and breadth of the speaker with an eye full of derision. "Cathy, this lamb of yours threatens like a bull," he said. "It is in danger of splitting its skull against my knuckles, my God. Mr. Linton, I'm mortally sorry that you are not worth knocking down." My master glanced towards the passage and signed me to fetch the men. He had no intention of hazarding a personal encounter. I obeyed the hint, but Mrs. Linton, suspecting something, followed. And when I attempted to call them, she pulled me back, slammed the door to, and locked it. "Fair means," she said in answer to her husband's look of angry surprise. "If you have not courage to attack him, make an apology or allow yourself to be beaten. It will correct you of feigning more valour than you possess. No, I'll swallow the key before you shall get it. I'm delightfully rewarded for my kindness to each. After constant indulgence of one's weak nature and the other's bad one, I earn for thanks 2 samples of blind ingratitude, stupid to absurdity. Edgar, I was defending you and yours, and I wish Heathcliff may flog you sick for daring to think an evil thought of me. I did not need the medium of a flogging to produce that effect on the master. He tried to wrest the key from Catherine's grasp, and for safety she flung it into the hottest part of the fire, whereupon Mr. Edgar was taken with a nervous trembling, and his countenance grew deadly pale. For his life he could not avert that excess of emotion, mingled anguish and humiliation overcame him completely. He leant on the back of a chair and covered his face. Oh heavens! In old days this would win you knighthood, exclaimed Mrs. Linton. We are vanquished. We are vanquished. Heathcliff would as soon lift a finger at you as the king would march his army against a colony of mice. Cheer up. You shan't be hurt. Your type is not a lamb. It's a suckling leveret. I wish you joy of the milk-blooded coward, Cathy, said her friend. I compliment you on your taste, and that is the slavering, shivering thing you preferred to me. I would not strike him with my fist, but I'd kick him with my foot, and experience considerable satisfaction. Is he weeping, or is he going to faint for fear? The fellow approached and gave the chair on which Linton rested a push. He'd better have kept his distance. My master quickly sprang erect and struck him full on the throat, a blow that would have levelled a slighter man. It took his breath for a minute, and while he choked, Mr. Linton walked out by the back door into the yard, and from thence to the front entrance. There, you've done with coming here, cried Catherine. Get away now. He'll return with a brace of pistols and 6 assistants. If he did overhear us, of course, he'd never forgive you. You played me an ill turn, Heathcliff, but go, make haste. I'd rather see Edgar at bay than you. Do you suppose I'm going with that blow burning in my gullet? He thundered. By hell, no. I'll crush his ribs, and like a rotten hazelnut before I cross the threshold. If I don't floor him now, I shall murder him sometime. So, as you value his existence, let me get at him. He's not coming, I interposed, framing a bit of a lie. There's the coachman and the 2 gardeners. You'll surely not wait to be thrust into the road by them. Each has a bludgeon, and master will very likely be watching from the parlour windows to see that they fulfil his orders. The gardeners and coachman were there, but Linton was with them. They had already entered the court. Heathcliff, on the second thoughts, resolved to avoid a struggle against 3 underlings. He seized the poker, smashed the lock from the inner door, and made his escape as they tramped in. Mrs. Linton, who was very much excited, bade me accompany her upstairs. She did not know my share in contributing to the disturbance, and I was anxious to keep her in ignorance. I'm nearly distracted, Nellie, she exclaimed, throwing herself on the sofa. 1,000 Smith's hammers are beating in my head. Tell Isabella to shun me. This uproar is owing to her, and should she or anyone else aggravate my anger at present, I shall get wild. And, Nellie, say to Edgar, if you see him again tonight, that I'm in danger of being seriously ill. I wish it may prove true. He startled and distressed me shockingly. I want to frighten him. Besides, he might come and begin a string of abuse or complainings. I'm certain I should recriminate, or, and God knows where we should end. Will you do so, my good Nelly? You are aware that I am no way blamable in this matter. What possessed him to turn listener? Heathcliff's talk was outrageous after you left us, but I could soon have diverted him from Isabella, and the rest meant nothing. Now, all is dashed wrong by the fool's craving to hear evil of self that haunts some people like a demon. Had Edgar never gathered our conversation, he would never have been the worse for it. Really. When he opened on me in that unreasonable tone of displeasure after I had scolded Heathcliff till I was hoarse for him, I did not care hardly what they did to each other, especially as I felt that, however the scene closed, we should all be driven asunder for nobody knows how long. Well, if I cannot keep Heathcliff for my friend, if Edgar will be mean and jealous, I'll try to break their hearts by breaking my own. That will be a prompt way of finishing it all, when I am pushed to extremity. But it's a deed to be reserved for a forlorn hope. I'd not take Linton by surprise with it. To this point, he has been discreet in dreading to provoke me. You must represent the peril of quitting that policy, and remind him of my passionate temper, virgin, when kindled or frenzy. I wish you could dismiss that apathy out of that countenance and look rather more anxious about me. The stolidity with which I received these instructions was, no doubt, rather exasperating, for they were delivered in perfect sincerity, but I believed the person who could plan the turning of her fits of passion to account beforehand might, by exerting her will, manage to control herself tolerable, even while under their influence, and I did not wish to frighten her husband, as she said, and multiply his annoyances for the purpose of serving her selfishness. Therefore, I said nothing when I met the master coming towards the parlour, but I took the liberty of turning back to listen whether they would resume their quarrel together. He began to speak first. "Remain where you are, Catherine," he said, without any anger in his voice, but with such sorrowful despondency. "I shall not stay. I'm neither come to wrangle nor be reconciled, but I wish just to learn whether, after this evening's events, you intend to continue your intimacy with—" "Oh, for mercy's sake," interrupted the mistress, stamping her foot. "For mercy's sake, let us hear no more of it now. Your cold blood cannot be worked into a fever. Your veins are full of ice water, but mine are boiling, and the sight of such chilliness makes them dance. To get rid of me, answer my question," persevered Mr. Linton. "You must answer it. And that violence does not alarm me. I have found that you can be as stoical as anyone when you please. Will you give up Heathcliff hereafter, or will you give up me? It is impossible for you to be my friend and his at the same time, and I absolutely require to know which you choose." "I require to be let alone," exclaimed Catherine furiously. "I demand it. Don't you see I can scarcely stand? Edgar, you leave me." She rang the bell till it broke with a twang. I entered leisurely. It was enough to try the temper for saying such senseless, wicked rages. There she lay, dashing her head against the arm of the sofa, and grinding her teeth so that you might fancy she would crash them to splinters. Mr. Linton stood looking at her in sudden compunction and fear. He told me to fetch some water. She had no breath for speaking. I brought a glassful, and as she would not drink, I sprinkled it on her face. In a few seconds she stretched herself out stiff and turned up her eyes, while her cheeks, at once blanched with livid, assumed the aspect of death. Linton looked terrified. "There is nothing in the world the matter," I whispered. I did not want him to yield, though I could not help being afraid in my heart. "She has blood on her lips," he said, shuddering. "Never mind," I answered tartly, and I told him how she had resolved, previous to his coming, on exhibiting a fit of frenzy. I incautiously gave the account aloud, and she heard me, for she started up, her hair flying over her shoulders, her eyes flashing, the muscles of her neck and arms standing out preternaturally. I made up my mind for broken bones at least, but she only glared about her for an instant, and then rushed from the room. The master directed me to follow. I did, to her chamber door. She hindered me from going further by securing it against me. As she never offered to descend to breakfast next morning, I went to ask whether she would have some carried up. "No," she replied peremptorily. The same question was repeated at dinner and tea, and again on the morrow after, and received the same answer. Mr. Linton, on his part, spent his time in the library and did not inquire concerning his wife's occupations. Isabella and he had had an hour's interview, during which he tried to elicit from her some sentiment of proper horror for Heathcliff's advances, but he could make nothing of her evasive replies, and was obliged to close the examination unsatisfactorily, adding, however, a solemn warning that if she were so insane as to encourage that worthless suitor, it would dissolve all bonds of relationship between herself and him. While Mrs. Linton moped about the park and garden, always silent, and almost always in tears, and her brother shut himself up among books that he never opened wearily, I guessed with a continual vague expectation that Catherine, repenting her conduct, would come of her own accord to ask pardon and seek a reconciliation. And she fasted pertinaciously, under the idea, probably, that at every meal Edgar was ready to choke for her absence, and pride alone held him from running to cast himself at her feet. I went about my household duties, convinced that the Grange had but one sensible soul in its wall, and that lodged in my body. I wasted no condolences on Miss, nor any expostulations on my mistress, nor did I pay much attention to the sighs of my master, who yearned to hear his lady's name, since he might not hear her voice. I determined they should come about as they pleased for me, and though it was a tiresomely slow process, I began to rejoice at length in a faint dawn of its progress, as I thought at first. Mrs. Linton, on the third day, unbarred her door, and having finished the water in a pitcher and decanter, desired a renewed supply, and a basin of gruel, for she believed she was dying. That I set down as a speech meant for Edgar ears, I believe no such thing, so I kept it to myself and brought her some tea and dry toast. She ate and drank eagerly, and sank back on her pillow again, clenching her hands and groaning. "Oh, I will die," she exclaimed, "since no one cares anything about me. I wish I had not taken that." Then, a good while after, I heard her murmur, "No, I'll not die. He'd be glad. He does not love me at all. He would never miss me." "Did you want anything, ma'am?" I inquired, still preserving my external composure in spite of her ghastly countenance and strange, exaggerated manner. "What is that apathetic been doing?" she demanded, pushing the thick, entangled locks from her wasted face. "Has he fallen into a lethargy, or is he dead?" "Neither," replied I. "If you mean Mr. Linton, he's tolerably well, I think, though his studies occupy him rather more than they ought. He's continually among his books since he has no other society." I should not have spoken so if I had known her true condition, but I could not get rid of the notion that she acted a part of her disorder. "Among his books?" she cried, confounded. "And I'm dying, I on the brink of the grave. My God, does he know how I'm altered?" continued she, staring at her reflection in a mirror hanging against the opposite wall. "Is that Catherine Linton? He imagined me in a pet in play, perhaps. Cannot you inform him that it is frightful earnest, Nelly? If it be not too late, as soon as I learn how he feels, I'll choose between these two. Either to starve at once, that would be no punishment unless he had a heart, or to recover and leave the country. Are you speaking the truth about him now? Take care. Is he actually so utterly indifferent for my life?" "Why, ma'am," I answered, "the master has no idea of your being deranged, and of course he does not fear that you will let yourself die of hunger." "You think not?" "Cannot you tell him I will?" she returned. "Persuade him. Speak of your own mind. Say you are certain I will." "No, you forget, Mrs. Linton," I suggested, "that you have eaten some food with a relish this evening, and tomorrow you will perceive its good effects." "If I were only sure it would kill him," she interrupted, "I'll kill myself directly. These 3 awful nights I've never closed my lids, and oh, I've been tormented. I've been haunted, Nelly. But I begin to fancy you don't like me. How strange. I thought, though everybody hated and despised each other, they could not avoid loving me. And they have all turned enemies in a few hours. They have. I'm positive. The people here. How dreary to meet death surrounded by their cold faces. Isabella, terrified and repelled, afraid to enter the room. It would be so dreadful to watch Catherine go. And Edgar, standing solemnly by to see it over, then offering prayers of thanks to God for restoring peace to his house and going back to his books. What, in the name of all that feels, has he to do with books? When I'm dying. Wuthering Heights. Join me for the next episode of Wuthering Heights. Join me for the next episode of Wuthering Heights and see what Catherine's going to do next. See you then, Morel saying. Join me for the next video of Wuthering Heights. Thank you. Bye.